What's up, everybody? Welcome to the last day of the God Never Said That series, and especially for this week, the idea of God said it, it's in the Bibles, so that settles it, and I'm just gonna believe it. If you watched any of the previous videos, you would know that earlier this week I said, when we were talking about the scriptures, like what are the scriptures? And I defined them as a love story. From Genesis 1 to Revelation 22, the scriptures, it's one beautiful and powerful love story. But sometimes as you go through and you've read this Bible and you're like, yeah, but if it's a love story, then how do you understand this story and how does that explain how loving God is? Because it sure doesn't seem very loving to me. If you go back and you understand the history, right? God's people, the Israelites, they were all slaves, right? For hundreds of years, they were slaves in Egypt. And then Moses comes along, you know the story, right? Let my people go, right? And Pharaoh, you know, there are plagues and there's pestilence and right? Stuff happens, there's death, it's terrible. Anyway, but you know the story. And then God's people are free. And here's the thing. God's people, the Israelites, they had this idea, right? They grew up with this idea for years and for generations that the gods or God or deity, that there are several of them, right? It's called polytheism. They grew up with this polytheistic worldview, that there are several gods. Some gods, you do things to make them happy, and then when you make those gods happy, you'll get good stuff. And then other gods, you got to do stuff for them to make them happy so that they don't give you bad stuff. And so they had this idea, they grew up with this understanding that there are several gods and you have to do things to make these gods happy in order to either get good things or to not get bad things. And then Moses comes along, frees the people, and explains Yahweh. And Yahweh speaks to them at Mount Sinai. And they're understanding the God of gods in a very new and fresh way. But here's the thing. One of the fundamental teachings that these people, God's people, the Israelites, were trying to understand is that there aren't multiple gods. It's not a polytheistic worldview. There is one God. And that kind of would have been a trip for them at first, to kind of wipe the slate clean of what they used to think God was, to recognize that there's just one God. Now, what does this have to do with bad stuff and evil things happening? God is very intentional with how he teaches and grows people. And if God would have introduced the thought of Lucifer and the devil and how this ruler of darkness is involved, it would have been easy for them at that time, based on how they grew up for generations of this whole polytheistic worldview. It would have been easy for them to easily connect. Oh, okay, I got it. There's Yahweh, he's the good God, and then there's Lucifer, there's the devil, there's Satan. He's a bad God. And so it would have been easy for them to be confused. That, okay, no, I know, okay, we don't have all these gods, but maybe there's one God that we have to do things to make him happy because he's good. But then there's this other God that we need to do things to make him happy so he doesn't give us bad. It would have been easy for them to slip into this mindset that Satan or the devil is actually a God. And God, in his infinite wisdom and mercy and grace and generosity, wanted to teach them who he was. And so he doesn't introduce this idea of a devil or Satan early on. In fact, if you go through your scriptures for the First Testament, for the Old Testament, there are huge chunks in the history of the Old Testament where there is no mention of a Satan or a devil or anything like that. It's like Lucifer isn't even introduced for an entire chunk of God's people's history. And why? It's because, right, at that time, it would have been easy for them to think that the devil or Satan is this God that brings bad things. And so ultimately, what does this mean about our God in the love story? There are things that happen in the scriptures and in history where God takes the blame. He doesn't want to confuse his people. He doesn't want to confuse them into thinking that there are multiple gods. No. And so he himself actually takes the blame for things in order to connect with them at that time, to grow them in their understanding of who he is, in their theology at that time. It's easy for us to be like, man, this God seems to do a whole lot of really bad things. But if we understand it, it's during this section of history when God was teaching his people, no, there are not multiple gods. Polytheism is not true. There's just one God. And that's what they needed to learn and understand at that point. So, it really is a love story. We really do have to take and understand these stories and these things in their scriptures, in their context. Again, you hear me say this all the time, and I think it's so important. What did this passage, what did this story, what did these scriptures initially mean to them then? What is that principle? And then therefore, then we apply it. What does it mean to us now? Let's unpack the scriptures. And when we do that, may the same Spirit who inspired the scripture authors to write those words inspire you and I as we then read those words.